A routine day turns into a nightmare. It was a sunny afternoon in the bustling streets of New Orleans, where Eleanor Jackson, a radiant and resilient woman 7 months into her pregnancy, strolled through the local grocery store. The rhythmic bounce of her unborn child reminded her of the joy and anticipation of the new life growing inside her. Eleanor hummed softly as she moved through the aisles, carefully selecting the best produce and ticking items off her shopping list. Little did she know, this seemingly ordinary day would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would shatter her world and test her family's strength like never before. The grocery store's automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss as Eleanor stepped out, her arms loaded with bags. The Louisiana heat greeted her, thick and humid, as she made her way across the parking lot toward her car. As she reached into her purse to retrieve her keys, a sudden screech of tires broke the serene afternoon. Eleanor froze in place as a blue and white police car abruptly sped into the lot and came to a halt just feet away from her. The jarring noise echoed against the nearby buildings, turning the heads of a few passersby, who quickly averted their gazes once they saw the officer step out. Officer Bradley Cole, infamous for his iron-fisted approach to law enforcement and his brazen displays of racial prejudice, emerged from the vehicle. His imposing frame, square jaw, and piercing gaze exuded an aura of dominance that made even the boldest individuals falter. Clad in his crisp uniform and dark sunglasses, Cole oozed a sense of superiority that filled the air with an unspoken tension. Eleanor instinctively clutched her grocery bags tighter, her heart rate quickening as a chill crept down her spine. "Stay right there," Cole barked, his voice sharp and commanding. His hand rested casually on the gun holstered at his hip, a deliberate display of power that made Eleanor's throat tighten. What's the matter, officer?" Eleanor stammered, her voice trembling as she looked around for help. The onlookers in the vicinity seemed to shrink back, their faces marked with a mixture of fear and disinterest. It was a silent reminder that Eleanor was alone in this moment, with no one willing to intervene. "You're loitering," Cole replied curtly, his lips curling into a sneer. "This is my jurisdiction, and I don't need people like you causing trouble here." Eleanor's brows knitted in confusion as she tried to process his accusation. "Loitering? I'm just coming back from the grocery store. I'm on my way home," she explained, her tone cautious yet resolute. She gestured to the bags in her hands as if to underscore the absurdity of his claim. But Cole wasn't interested in her explanation. Instead, he took a step closer, his demeanor growing more menacing with each passing second. "Don't play games with me," he growled, his icy eyes narrowing. "I said stay put." Eleanor took an instinctive step back, her protective instincts kicking in as her hand reflexively moved to her swollen belly. "Officer, I'm pregnant," she said softly, her voice laced with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Please, I just want to get home safely." Her words, intended to diffuse the situation, only seemed to enrage Cole further. "Don't think I'll go easy on you because of that," he spat, his tone venomous. The air between them grew heavy with tension, and Eleanor could feel the eyes of onlookers cautiously observing the escalating scene, some raising their phones to record. "Officer, please," Eleanor began, but before she could finish, Cole's patience snapped. "Shut up," he roared, lunging toward her and shoving her forcefully on the shoulder. Eleanor staggered backward, her heart pounding as her mind raced with disbelief and terror. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Stand still," I said, Cole bellowed, his voice echoing in the now silent parking lot. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong," Eleanor pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. But her words fell on deaf ears. Cole's rage had spiraled beyond control, fueled by a deep-seated hatred that blinded him to reason. In one horrifying moment, he lashed out with his booted foot, delivering a brutal kick to Eleanor's abdomen. The world seemed to stop as Eleanor let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing to the ground as pain radiated through her body. Her groceries spilled across the pavement, apples rolling away in slow, surreal motion. The impact of the blow was more than just physical. It was a devastating strike against her dignity, her safety, and her unborn child. Eleanor curled into a protective ball, her hands clutching her belly as sobs racked her body. The baby inside her seemed to thrash in protest, its fragile life endangered by the violent act. For a moment, there was only silence, save for Eleanor's anguished cries. Then, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. "He kicked her. She's pregnant," someone shouted, their voice trembling with disbelief. Phones captured the horrific scene from every angle, the brutal act immortalized in digital evidence that would soon ignite a firestorm. Cole stood over her, his face devoid of remorse as he glanced around at the growing crowd. "Back off," he barked, his hand moving to his gun as a warning to anyone considering stepping in. But this time, his authority failed to intimidate. The witnesses, emboldened by their shared outrage, began calling out his actions, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. As the distant wail of ambulance sirens pierced the air, Cole retreated to his car, his face a mask of cold indifference. He believed, as he always had, that he would emerge unscathed. After all, the system had protected him before. Why should this time be any different? Eleanor was rushed to the hospital, her life hanging by a thread as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her. Meanwhile, the video of the assault spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeForEleanor and #StopPoliceBrutality began trending, drawing attention from activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike. But as Eleanor fought for her life, and the life of her unborn child, one man was already preparing to wage a battle of his own, a battle that would expose the darkness lurking in the shadows of power and demand justice for the woman he loved. That man was her husband, Ethan Jackson. Ethan Jackson's promise. The sterile smell of antiseptics filled the air as Ethan Jackson rushed through the hospital's hallways. His boots thudded against the tiled floor, each step echoing his mounting fear. The frantic phone call he had received minutes earlier still rang in his ears. "It's Eleanor. She's hurt. She's at Street Mercy's hospital." The words had sent a cold, numbing shock through Ethan's entire being. He hadn't asked for details. He hadn't needed to. All he knew was that his wife, the love of his life, the mother of his unborn child, was in danger. And that was enough to send him racing through the streets of New Orleans, reckless and desperate. Bursting into the emergency room, Ethan's eyes scanned the chaos around him. Nurses rushed to and fro. Doctors consulted charts, and patients moaned in pain. His heart pounded as he searched for a familiar face. Finally, he saw her, Eleanor, pale and fragile, lying on a stretcher with an oxygen mask over her face. Her hands cradled her belly protectively, and her expression was a mixture of pain and exhaustion. "Eleanor," Ethan choked out, rushing to her side. He knelt beside the stretcher, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a brief moment her eyes met his. "Ethan," she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. Tears welled up in her eyes and streamed down her cheeks. "The baby, he kicked me." Those words struck Ethan like a thunderbolt. Anger and sorrow collided within him, but he forced himself to remain calm for her sake. He squeezed her hand tightly, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "You and the baby are going to be okay. I promise." Eleanor's grip on his hand weakened as she slipped into unconsciousness, the toll of her injuries too much for her fragile body. Ethan's chest tightened as panic threatened to overtake him. A nurse placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her expression kind but firm. "Mr. Jackson, we need to take her into surgery immediately. There's a risk of placental abruption. We're doing everything we can to save both of them." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He watched helplessly as they wheeled Eleanor away, the doors swinging shut behind her. For a moment, he stood there, frozen in place. Then, As the reality of the situation sank in, his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto a nearby chair. The image of Eleanor lying there, vulnerable and broken, played over and over in his mind. He felt a storm brewing inside him, one he hadn't experienced in years. It was the same rage and determination he had felt during his time in the Special Forces, where life and death decisions had been a daily reality. But this time, it was personal. This time, the fight wasn't for a mission or a country. It was for his family. Hours passed, but Ethan barely noticed. He sat hunched over in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together as he replayed the details of the incident he had been told. A grocery store, a racist cop, a violent attack. His fists clenched as he imagined the officer's face, the smug expression of someone who believed he was untouchable. The sound of footsteps pulled Ethan out of his thoughts. A man approached him, tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of familiarity. It was Marcus, an old friend from Ethan's military days. Marcus had been the one to call him earlier, and now he stood before Ethan with a grim expression. "I came as soon as I heard," Marcus said, sitting beside him. "How's Eleanor?" "They took her into surgery," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. "The baby's at risk. They're doing everything they can." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "She's strong, Ethan. She'll pull through." "But what about the bastard who did this?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "Officer Bradley Cole," he spat. "He's going to pay for what he did. I swear it." Marcus nodded, his expression hardening. "You're not alone in this, brother. Whatever you need, I've got your back." Ethan looked at Marcus, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. The system that protected officers like Cole was deeply entrenched, but Ethan was no stranger to taking on powerful adversaries. His military training had taught him that even the most formidable enemies had weaknesses. All he needed was a plan. The next morning, Ethan began his quest for justice. He started by gathering every piece of evidence he could find. He scoured social media, where videos of the attack had gone viral overnight. The footage was damning. Clear images of Officer Cole kicking Eleanor, her anguished cries, and the outraged reactions of witnesses. Ethan downloaded every clip, ensuring he had copies in case they were taken down. He reached out to the people who had recorded the incident, asking them to provide statements. Many were hesitant, fearing retaliation from the police, but Ethan's sincerity and determination won them over. Slowly, he built a network of witnesses willing to stand with him. But Ethan knew that eyewitness accounts and video evidence wouldn't be enough. The system had a way of dismissing even the most incriminating evidence when it came to protecting its own. He needed more. He needed to expose the rot at the heart of the system that allowed officers like Cole to act with impunity. Ethan dug into Cole's history, scouring public records and news articles. What he found only fueled his anger. Cole had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. Yet each complaint had been quietly dismissed, and Cole had continued to rise through the ranks. It was clear that he was protected by powerful allies within the department. Ethan also discovered a pattern in Cole's behavior. He targeted vulnerable individuals, people he believed wouldn't fight back. But this time, Cole had made a mistake. He had targeted Ethan Jackson's family, and Ethan was determined to make him pay. As the days passed, Ethan's resolve only grew stronger. He reached out to his network of friends from the military, many of whom had gone on to work in law, journalism, and activism. They provided him with invaluable support, helping him navigate the complexities of the legal system and connect with organizations dedicated to fighting police brutality. One of those connections was Mia Carter, a prominent civil rights attorney known for taking on high-profile cases. When Ethan told her about Eleanor's case, Mia didn't hesitate to offer her help. "This isn't just about your wife," she said. "This is about every person who's been victimized by this system. We're going to fight this together." Ethan also sought out community leaders and activists, rallying support for Eleanor's cause. He attended meetings, spoke at rallies, and shared his story with anyone who would listen. The more people he spoke to, the more he realized that Eleanor's story was just one of many. The pain and anger he saw in their faces mirrored his own, and it strengthened his determination to seek justice not just for his family, but for the entire community. Back at the hospital, Eleanor began to recover, though her journey was far from over. When she finally awoke, weak but alive, Ethan was by her side. He took her hand in his and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I promise I won't let anyone hurt you or our baby ever again." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't let him get away with this." Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. "He won't," he said. "I swear to you, Eleanor, he won't." In the days that followed, Ethan's fight for justice gained momentum. The viral videos, combined with his relentless advocacy, sparked a wave of outrage across the city. Protesters took to the streets, demanding accountability for Officer Cole and systemic reform within the police department. Ethan knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for the challenge. He was a soldier, a husband, and soon to be a father, and he would stop at nothing to protect his family and ensure that justice was served. The rising storm. The city of New Orleans had seen its share of protests over the years, but the outrage that followed Officer Bradley Cole's assault on Eleanor Jackson was different. It wasn't just a protest, it was a reckoning. The streets teemed with people from all walks of life: students, activists, clergy, families, and even local business owners, uniting under the banner of Justice for Eleanor. The hashtags #JusticeForEleanor and #StopPoliceBrutality had become rallying cries, echoing across social media and drawing national attention. At the heart of this movement was Ethan Jackson, a man who had once been trained to fight in war zones, but now found himself leading a different kind of battle, a fight against systemic injustice that had long been ignored. Standing in the modest living room of their small home, Ethan surveyed the growing stack of documents, video evidence, and witness statements scattered across the table. The room, once a place of quiet solace, had become a makeshift war room. Ethan was joined by his closest allies: Marcus, his steadfast military friend; Mia Carter, the fiery civil rights attorney; and Deshaun Lewis, a respected community organizer. Together, they formed the core team spearheading the campaign for justice. The tension in the room was palpable as they strategized their next moves. The evidence dossier. "Here's what we've got," Ethan began, spreading out the documents for everyone to see. "We have multiple videos of the assault, eyewitness accounts, and a paper trail of complaints against Cole that were mysteriously dismissed." Marcus leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What about internal police records? Any chance we can get access to his disciplinary history?" "That's where it gets tricky," Mia interjected. "The department will stonewall us at every turn. They've been covering for Cole for years, and they won't give us anything without a fight." Ethan tapped the table thoughtfully. "Then we need to put pressure on them from the outside. The public's already on our side. If we can keep the spotlight on this, they won't have a choice but to respond." Deshaun nodded in agreement. "We can organize another rally, bigger than the last one. We'll bring in speakers, community leaders, clergy, even families who've been affected by police brutality. We'll make it impossible for them to ignore us." The group nodded in unison, their resolve growing stronger. Ethan felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. For the first time since Eleanor had been attacked, he felt like they were making progress, but he knew the road ahead was fraught with obstacles. The system pushes back. As the campaign gained traction, the backlash from the system was swift and brutal. Officer Cole, emboldened by years of impunity, doubled down on his defense. Through his attorney, he issued a statement denying any wrongdoing and accusing Eleanor of acting aggressively during the encounter, a narrative that was quickly debunked by the video evidence, but still managed to sow doubt among certain circles. The police department, meanwhile, remained silent. Despite the growing public outcry, they refused to place Cole on leave or open an investigation. Instead, they launched a smear campaign against Eleanor, leaking irrelevant details from her past in a calculated attempt to discredit her. Ethan watched the news coverage with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "They're trying to paint her as the villain," he said, slamming his fist against the table. "They'll do anything to protect him." Mia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This is what they do," she said. "But we won't let them win. The truth is on our side, and we're going to make sure everyone knows it." A community united. The next rally was held in Washington Square Park, a sprawling green space in the heart of New Orleans. The organizers had expected a few hundred people to attend, but when Ethan arrived, he was greeted by a sea of faces, thousands of them, all standing in solidarity with Eleanor. The stage was modest, a simple platform with a microphone and a banner that read "Justice for Eleanor." Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding as he listened to the speakers. A pastor spoke passionately about the moral imperative to fight injustice. A mother tearfully recounted her own experience with police violence, and a young poet moved the crowd to tears with her words. Finally, it was Ethan's turn. He stepped onto the stage, the weight of thousands of eyes and the hopes of an entire community pressing down on him. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the microphone and began to speak. "My name is Ethan Jackson," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here today because my wife Eleanor was brutally attacked by a man who was supposed to protect her. She's 7 months pregnant. She's carrying our child. And that didn't stop Officer Cole from kicking her to the ground." The crowd murmured angrily, their outrage palpable. "This isn't just about Eleanor," Ethan continued. "This is about every person who has been harassed, beaten, or killed by those who abuse their power. This is about a system that protects the guilty and punishes the innocent. And it's about us, because we're the ones who have the power to change it." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Ethan felt a surge of energy as he continued, his words flowing freely. "I won't rest until Eleanor gets justice, and I won't stop fighting until this system is held accountable for what it's done. But I can't do it alone. I need all of you to stand with me. Because together, we can make a difference. Together, we can demand change." As Ethan stepped down from the stage, he was met with a wave of support. Strangers hugged him, activists offered their help, and community leaders pledged their resources. For the first time, Ethan felt like they were truly building something, a movement that could challenge the system and demand justice. The turning point. The rally was a turning point. The media coverage was relentless, and the public pressure became impossible to ignore. The mayor of New Orleans issued a statement condemning police brutality and calling for an independent investigation into Cole's actions. The governor weighed in as well, urging transparency and accountability. Ethan, however, remained cautious. He knew that statements and promises meant nothing without action. He continued to work tirelessly, meeting with journalists, gathering more evidence, and rallying support. Every day was a battle, but Ethan refused to back down. Meanwhile, Eleanor slowly recovered in the hospital. Though her body was healing, the emotional scars ran deep. Ethan spent every moment he could by her side, reassuring her that justice was within their grasp. "Ethan," she said one evening, her voice soft but determined, "no matter what happens, promise me you won't give up." Ethan took her hand in his eyes brimming with tears. "I promise," he said. "I'll fight until my last breath. For you, for our baby, for all of us." Cole's shield cracks. Behind the scenes, the pressure was beginning to take its toll on Officer Cole. The viral videos, the protests, and the relentless media coverage had made him a pariah. Even some of his fellow officers began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with his actions. But Cole wasn't the only one feeling the heat. The department's leadership faced mounting scrutiny as allegations of corruption and cover-ups surfaced. Whistleblowers came forward, revealing a culture of impunity that had allowed officers like Cole to act without consequence. Ethan knew they were nearing a breaking point. The shield that had protected Cole for so long was beginning to crack. But he also knew that the battle was far from over. The system wouldn't go down without a fight, and Ethan was prepared to face whatever came next. The rising storm showed no signs of slowing. It was a battle for justice, for accountability, and for the soul of a community. And at the center of it all was Ethan Jackson, a man who refused to be silenced, who refused to give up, and who was determined to see justice served. The unraveling of Officer Cole. The sound of echoing footsteps filled the marble corridors of the courthouse as Ethan Jackson walked purposefully beside Mia Carter. Clad in a tailored Navy suit, Ethan's posture was tense, his face set in a stoic expression. Beside him, Mia, ever the composed civil rights attorney, carried a thick folder of evidence under her arm. Today was a critical step in their journey for justice. The official filing of the lawsuit against Officer Bradley Cole and the New Orleans Police Department. Ethan's heart pounded with a mixture of determination and apprehension. He knew that filing the lawsuit would escalate the fight to a level Cole and his enablers couldn't ignore. It was no longer just about public outrage or social media campaigns. It was about holding a corrupt system legally accountable. The lawsuit. As they entered the courtroom, the buzz of whispers filled the air. Journalists and activists filled the gallery, their eyes fixed on Ethan and Mia. The moment was heavy with significance, the first official challenge to Officer Cole's unchecked brutality. Mia stepped forward, handing the folder to the court clerk, and the paperwork was stamped with an air of finality. This lawsuit isn't just about seeking justice for Eleanor, Mia said during the press conference that followed. It's about exposing the culture of corruption that has allowed Officer Cole and others like him to abuse their power with impunity. We demand accountability, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire system that enabled this tragedy. Ethan stood beside her, his gaze steady as the cameras flashed. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was calm but firm. This isn't just my fight. This is our fight. For every person who's been hurt, silenced, or ignored by those sworn to protect us, this is for you. We won't stop until justice is served. Cole under siege. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley Cole sat in his suburban home, the glow of his television illuminating his otherwise dark living room. He scowled as he watched the news coverage of the lawsuit, the image of Ethan Jackson standing tall on the courthouse steps, sending a fresh wave of anger through him. Cole had always been confident in his ability to escape accountability. Years of cultivating powerful allies within the police department had left him feeling untouchable. But the lawsuit, combined with the relentless media coverage and public pressure, was beginning to chip away at his defenses. "Dan vultures," Cole muttered, pouring himself the stiff drink. His hand shook slightly as he sipped the whiskey, the reality of his situation beginning to set in. For the first time, he felt the weight of consequences pressing down on him. The department, too, was starting to buckle under the pressure. High-ranking officials scrambled to manage the crisis, issuing vague statements about conducting an internal investigation. But the public wasn't buying it. Protests outside police headquarters grew larger by the day, with chants of "justice for Eleanor" echoing through the city. Ethan's investigation deepens. While the lawsuit took center stage, Ethan continued his own investigation into Cole's history. With the help of Marcus and Mia, he uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that painted a damning picture of the officer's career. Through Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests, they obtained disciplinary records that revealed a long list of complaints against Cole, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. Most had been dismissed without proper investigation, but a few contained telling details. In one instance, a young black man had accused Cole of planting drugs on him during a routine traffic stop. Another complaint described Cole shoving a teenager to the ground for refusing to comply. Ethan also uncovered financial records that suggested corruption within the department. Payments from private security companies and off-the-books bonuses hinted at a web of illicit dealings that extended far beyond Cole. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Ethan said during a late-night strategy session with his team. "This is about a system that's rotten to the core, a community divided." As the case gained national attention, the city of New Orleans found itself at a crossroads. Support for Eleanor and Ethan was overwhelming, but there were also those who stood by Cole, framing him as a victim of a media witch hunt. Police unions rallied to his defense, using scare tactics to sway public opinion. One evening, Ethan received an anonymous letter slipped under his door. It was filled with threats, warning him to back off before it's too late. Marcus immediately stepped up security, enlisting a few trusted friends from their military days to watch over the Jackson family. "This isn't just about justice anymore," Marcus said grimly. "It's about survival. They'll do anything to protect their own." Ethan refused to be intimidated. "Let them try," he said. "I've faced worse threats before. I won't let them silence me." A turning point. The tide began to turn when a whistleblower from within the police department came forward. Detective Angela Morales, a veteran officer with an impeccable record, contacted Mia with explosive information. Morales revealed that she had been pressured by her superiors to bury complaints against Cole and other officers. "They protect their own at all costs," Morales said during a secret meeting with Ethan and Mia. "But I can't stay silent anymore. What happened to Eleanor was the last straw." Morales provided a treasure trove of internal emails, memos, and recorded conversations that exposed the department's systematic efforts to shield officers like Cole. The evidence was damning, and it gave Ethan's team the leverage they needed to push the case forward. The breaking news. The next morning, the headlines were ablaze with the revelations. News outlets across the country reported on the corruption within the New Orleans Police Department, using Morales's evidence to paint a vivid picture of institutional failure. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Protesters marched in record numbers, demanding the resignation of top officials and the immediate arrest of Bradley Cole. Social media erupted with calls for reform, and the pressure on the city government reached a boiling point. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. As he stood on the steps of the hospital, watching Eleanor cradle their newborn daughter, he felt a surge of hope. They had survived the storm, but the fight was far from over. "She's beautiful," Ethan whispered, gazing at his daughter's tiny face. "She's strong, just like her mother." Eleanor smiled weakly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We're going to make sure she grows up in a world where this doesn't happen anymore." The legal showdown. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and people lined the walls, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Outside, the steps of the courthouse buzzed with activists holding signs and chanting slogans, their voices carrying into the halls. The case against Officer Bradley Cole had become a national spectacle, a referendum on systemic police brutality. Ethan Jackson sat at the plaintiff's table, his face calm but resolute. Beside him was Mia Carter, her legal pad filled with meticulous notes. Across the room, Officer Cole sat with his defense attorney, his face a mask of defiance. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Cole exuded the arrogance of a man who had spent years evading accountability. The judge, an older woman with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the courtroom, and the chatter died instantly. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The battle for justice was about to begin. Opening arguments. Mia rose first, her presence commanding as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than just a single act of violence. It is about a pattern of abuse and a system that has allowed it to flourish. On that fateful day, Officer Bradley Cole brutally assaulted Eleanor Jackson, a 7 months pregnant woman, without provocation. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of unchecked misconduct. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The evidence will show that Officer Cole has a history of abusing his power and targeting vulnerable individuals, particularly people of color. But this time, his actions were captured for the world to see. This time, there will be accountability. The defense attorney, a slick man with a confident smirk, countered with a narrative designed to discredit Eleanor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about perception versus reality." Officer Cole was doing his job in a high-stress situation. The plaintiff's claims are exaggerated, and the evidence is being twisted to fit a narrative. Ethan clenched his fists under the table as he listened. It was a tactic he had expected, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. The witnesses. The prosecution began by calling a series of witnesses to the stand. First was an elderly woman who had been in the parking lot that day. Her testimony was powerful, recounting how she had seen Cole kick Eleanor and watched in horror as Eleanor crumpled to the ground. She cried out for help, the woman said, her voice trembling. But he just stood there, looking like he didn't care. Next came the medical experts, who detailed the extent of Eleanor's injuries and the risks they had posed to both her and her unborn child. The jury listened intently as the doctors explained how the stress and trauma could have led to fatal complications. But the most damning testimony came from Detective Angela Morales, the whistleblower who had exposed the department's corruption. Morales took the stand with a quiet determination, her words measured but devastating. For years, complaints against Officer Cole were buried, she testified. There was a culture within the department that protected officers like him. They believed they were untouchable, and Cole was one of the worst offenders. What happened to Eleanor Jackson was not an accident. It was the predictable result of a system that prioritizes loyalty over justice. The defense attempted to discredit Morales, questioning her motives and accusing her of seeking attention. But Maya quickly dismantled their arguments, pointing out Morales's impeccable record and her decision to come forward at great personal risk. The cross-examination. When it was Cole's turn to testify, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. He took the stand with a smug expression, but Mia was ready for him. Her cross-examination was relentless, exposing the inconsistencies in his account and forcing him to confront the evidence against him. "You claim you felt threatened by a pregnant woman carrying groceries?" Maya asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "I didn't know she was pregnant at the time," Cole replied, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Mia raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying you didn't notice the very visible evidence of her pregnancy? And yet you claim to have assessed the situation carefully enough to determine she was a threat." Cole hesitated, his confidence faltering under Mia's scrutiny. The jury watched as she methodically dismantled his defense, piece by piece. The closing arguments. When it came time for closing arguments, Mia delivered a speech that resonated deeply with everyone in the room. "This case isn't just about Eleanor Jackson," she said, her voice steady and impassioned. "It's about every person who has suffered under a system that allows people like Bradley Cole to abuse their power. It's about standing up and saying, enough is enough." Officer Cole's actions were not the actions of a protector. They were the actions of a bully, emboldened by a system that has failed us all. The defense's closing argument tried once again to paint Eleanor as unreliable and the situation as a misunderstanding. But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 tense days. Ethan barely slept, his mind consumed with worry and anticipation. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The judge addressed the jury foreperson. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing with a folded piece of paper in hand. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. "In the case of Jackson v. Cole, we find the defendant, Officer Bradley Cole, guilty of assault and battery, and liable for damages caused by his actions." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a wave of cheers from the gallery. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his eyes brimming with tears. He turned to Mia, who gave him a small, triumphant nod. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in celebration. Ethan and Eleanor, who had been following the trial remotely due to her recovery, were hailed as symbols of resilience and courage. The victory was a major step forward, not just for their family, but for the community as a whole. A new chapter. As the dust settled, Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. The verdict was a milestone, but the systemic issues that had allowed Cole's actions still needed to be addressed. With Mia and Marcus by his side, Ethan began working on broader initiatives to reform the police department and hold other officers accountable. Eleanor, now fully recovered, joined him in these efforts. Together, they shared their story at community events and advocated for policy changes that would ensure no one else would have to endure what they had. Their daughter, a bright-eyed baby with a curious smile, became a symbol of hope for the future. She'll grow up knowing that her parents fought for what was right. Eleanor said one evening, holding the baby close, and that justice, no matter how difficult, is always worth fighting for. For Ethan, the journey had been grueling, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger. Their family and their community forever changed. And while the battle for justice was far from over, Ethan knew one thing for certain. They had taken the first step toward a brighter tomorrow. A community transformed. The verdict against Officer Bradley Cole was more than just a legal decision. It was a spark that ignited a deeper transformation within the city of New Orleans. For years, the community had endured a system marred by corruption and abuse. But now, for the first time, they saw a glimmer of hope that real change was possible. For Ethan and Eleanor Jackson, however, the fight was far from over. Their victory in the courtroom had given them a platform, but it also made them targets in a larger battle against systemic injustice. Building a movement. In the weeks following the trial, Ethan and Eleanor became the faces of a burgeoning movement for police reform. They were invited to speak at rallies, schools, and community centers, sharing their story and calling for action. Their message was clear. Justice for Eleanor was only the beginning. Ethan stood before a crowd of thousands one crisp fall evening, his voice resonating through the megaphone. We fought for justice in that courtroom, and we won. But what about the people who didn't have cameras to record their pain? What about the families who never got their day in court? We owe it to them to keep fighting. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. Many held signs with slogans like "End Police Brutality" and "Justice for All." Eleanor, standing beside Ethan, held their infant daughter in her arms. Her presence was a testament to resilience and hope, a living reminder of why the fight mattered. The resistance. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Within the police department, resistance was fierce. Officer Cole's conviction had sent shockwaves through the ranks, and many officers viewed it as a betrayal. The police union, emboldened by years of unchecked power, launched a campaign to undermine the movement. They painted Ethan and Eleanor as agitators, accusing them of endangering public safety. One evening, as Ethan returned home from a community meeting, he found a hateful message spray-painted across their front door. Traitor. The sight made his blood boil, but he refused to let fear deter him. They want us to back down, Ethan said, scrubbing the graffiti off the door with Marcus's help. But they don't understand who they're dealing with. Eleanor watched from the porch, holding their daughter close. We've come too far to stop now, she said, her voice steady. We can't let them scare us into silence. Reform begins. Despite the resistance, the movement gained momentum. City officials, under immense public pressure, announced sweeping reforms to the police department. A civilian oversight board was established, tasked with investigating complaints against officers. Body cameras became mandatory, and new training programs emphasized de-escalation and cultural competency. Ethan and Eleanor were instrumental in shaping these reforms, working closely with policymakers and community leaders. They also partnered with nonprofit organizations to create programs aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. "We're not just fighting against something," Eleanor said during an interview on a national news program. "We're fighting for something, a system that truly protects and serves everyone." Cole's reckoning. While the reforms represented progress, the consequences for Bradley Cole were still unfolding. After his conviction, he faced additional charges stemming from other complaints that had been buried for years. Several whistleblowers, inspired by Detective Angela Moreles's courage, came forward with new evidence of Cole's misconduct. In a separate civil suit, Ethan and Eleanor sought damages for the trauma Cole had inflicted. During the proceedings, they learned of the full extent of his crimes, including evidence tampering and physical abuse of detainees. Cole's once protected career unraveled entirely, culminating in a lengthy prison sentence. For Ethan, watching Cole led away in handcuffs was a moment of vindication. "This isn't about revenge," he said afterward. "It's about accountability. People like Cole need to know that their actions have consequences, healing and moving forward." Though justice had been served, the journey had taken a toll on the Jackson family. Eleanor spent months in therapy, working through the emotional scars left by the attack. Ethan, too, grappled with the weight of the fight, often waking in the middle of the night with memories of the trial and protests replaying in his mind. Their love for each other, however, remained unshaken. They leaned on one another for support, drawing strength from their shared purpose and their daughter's innocent laughter. "I wouldn't have made it through this without you," Eleanor told Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their quiet neighborhood. "You're the strongest person I know," Ethan replied, wrapping an arm around her. "You've been my reason to keep going every single day." Their daughter, now crawling and babbling, brought light into their lives. They named her Hope, a fitting tribute to the journey they had endured and the future they were building. A national impact. The Jacksons' fight inspired similar movements across the country. Other communities began demanding police accountability, organizing protests, and filing lawsuits against corrupt officers. Ethan and Eleanor became national advocates, traveling to cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles to support grassroots efforts. Their story also caught the attention of lawmakers in Washington, D.C., where it fueled debates about federal legislation to address police brutality. Ethan testified before Congress, sharing his experiences and urging elected officials to take action. "This isn't a partisan issue," he said during his testimony. "It's about human dignity. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their race, gender, or background, has to live in fear of those who are supposed to protect them." Legacy of change. Years later, the Jacksons looked back on their journey with a sense of pride and humility. Their fight had been grueling, but it had led to tangible change. The reforms they helped implement had made their city safer and more equitable, and their work continued to inspire others. Hope, now a spirited young girl, often asked about the story of how her parents had fought for justice. "You were brave," she would say, her wide eyes filled with admiration. Eleanor would smile and stroke her daughter's hair. "We did it for you," she would reply, "so you could grow up in a better world." As the sun set over New Orleans, Ethan and Eleanor stood hand in hand on the porch of their home. The scars of their past were still there, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of what they had overcome. Their story was no longer just about pain and injustice. It was about hope, resilience, and the enduring belief that even in the face of darkness, change was possible. Together, they had proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, and in doing so, they had left an indelible mark on their community and the world.